Thank you, Dr. Landers, for that wonderful, generous introduction. So, if we could have the first slide, please, the introductory slide. There we go. So thank you so much for inviting me tonight to deliver the keynote address at your annual meeting. And it's an honor to have the opportunity to share Mrs. Thompson's story with you and the story of the VNA as well. Dr. Landers contacted me because he was really interested in reconnecting the organization with its founder. And luckily I was down the street and I happened to be working on a biography of Mrs. Thompson. I have been writing and researching her life for almost 2 years now, and it has become really probably the most rewarding project of my entire career. As much as I love teaching students and mentoring students, I feel a real calling to bring her story to people. And it's so interesting that Dr. Landers brought up David McCullough, because he's really such an idol of mine. I love Dr. David McCullough. And he always, when he wrote biographies, he always said, I just want to bring this story to people. I want people to connect with the story. And that's how I feel every day as I work on Mrs. Thompson's life story. The title of the presentation that I came up with for tonight is The Leadership of Geraldine L. Thompson, Public Health, Social Justice, and Democracy. And the reason I chose this title is because it really sums up her philosophy, that her dedication to the VNA was her connection to people, morality, and to democracy. For over 50 years, she served Monmouth County, the state of New Jersey, and the nation as well. She was one of the most important leaders of her generation. She belongs in the pantheon of great reformers such as Jane Addams, Clara Barton, and Mary Church Terrell. Yet she has been forgotten. It's important for us to remember her. And I want to connect again with something Dr. Landers said about why we study history. We study history to understand ourselves. And it's important for the people at the VNA to understand your history so that you understand the connection from the past to the present. And her story is also an inspiration to us, an inspiration for us to follow in her footsteps, to serve our community, to have compassion for others, and to strengthen our democracy while we're doing it. Tonight, I'm going to talk about your founder with the goal of trying to understand her. As her biographer, what I struggle with is I want to understand her. I want to understand what she was all about. Why did she give so much time and energy to the VNA? What made her her? So I'm going to start with a story from 1901. Next slide, please. So maybe not what you expected, right? Her standing there with a shotgun out in the field. But, she and her husband were he was a sportsman, and she also went hunting with him a great deal. She was a really good hunter. She could go hunting with the men, and she was very, very good at it. And so the story I wanted to start with is a story about one of their hunting trips they took out west. They often hired a very famous hunting guide named Jake Bora. Jake Bora was Teddy Roosevelt's hunting guide. So Lewis Thompson, her husband, was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and they were contemporaries, and they both loved hunting out west. I found this article about one particular hunting trip in 1901 where it was about 6 people and Jake Bora out trying to find and hunt mountain lions. And about 2 days into the trip, they found a very large mountain lion. And Jake Bora had hunting dogs with him, and one of his hunting dogs went after the mountain lion. And before you know it, the hunting dog and the mountain lion are attacking each other and fighting. And this is what was reported in the newspaper about what happened next. Quote, Mrs. Thompson, eager to rescue the dog, grabbed her trusty rifle, but Mr. Bora prevented her from shooting for fear she would kill the dog instead of the lion. As first one and then the other was on top, Jake then caught the lion by the tail and pulled with all his might. But the infuriated beast was so intensely engaged with the dog that he paid but little attention to the surroundings. But Mrs. Thompson could not stand it to see the dog killed. So as she had on a very heavy pair of boots, she waded right in upon the animal. And after making a few unsuccessful kicks at him, she finally landed with the heel of her boot in the vicinity of his heart, and leaping into the air, the beast fell over dead. This is your founder. A little 5'4" tall woman with these grizzly old West Mountain people, right? Hunters and her husband, and she's the one who wades in with the mountain lion. I love this story because it shows her compassion, it shows her fearlessness, and it shows her ferocity. Fighting for the underdog, right? Fighting for people. Next slide, please. So, in order to have democracy, right, she says you have to fight for it day and night, or it'll slip away from you. She said this in 1965, and I think probably we all can sort of feel how relevant that is even today, right? That we're still thinking about this. How do we hold on to our democracy? We have to fight for it. We have to stand up for it. She had this incredible sense of duty and the sense that we have all to be responsible for our communities and for our democracy. Next slide, please. In the annual report for Monmouth County Organization of Social Services, she talks about this idea of the best citizen. Who is the best citizen? The best citizen is somebody who understands their connection from the smallest to the largest part of society. Somebody who realizes how dependent the welfare of each individual is on the proper functioning of government. And so I believe that this quote from the annual report that she wrote really reflects her belief, her philosophy, that in order to have a stable society, we have to help each other. We have to pick each other up. We have to support each other. It benefits everyone. Not just, she's not a sentimentalist. She's not sentimental about giving people or helping people, but she understands that it has a larger purpose, that it will overall make society and the nation stronger. She talks in the same report about this idea that the work that MCOS was doing was interlocking. The idea that we need to work with as well as work for people. Next slide, please. So this is a slide of when she's, much older, the 1960s likely, and she's handing a check to the head of the Boy Scouts in Monmouth County. One of the things I think is interesting about her is that she was not a nurse, she was not a doctor, she was not a social worker, she was not a teacher. And in fact, it's very hard to label her. She never took a salary. She worked for over 50 years for the organization and as well as sat on numerous boards. She never took a salary. She was a leader in a variety of different areas, including public health, education, mental health, prison and corrections, as well as politics, and especially environmental conservation. She was an incredible leader in environmental conservation efforts. Her leadership really extended way beyond the VNA. So I'm always constantly amazed at the number of different boards and organizations she was involved with. She was on Red Cross, American Cancer Society, the Boy Scouts, the Audubon Society, and go on and on. She had an irrepressible passion. and energy, and approached problems with enormous creativity. And that was, I was really moved by the earlier video showing the last year's work of the VNAHG, because I think that she would be so happy to see the creativity being employed in helping people. She also had this incredible sense of duty and responsibility that as a woman of high society, she was a high society woman, that people who were the wealthier, high-income people with advantages had a duty to help other people. Next slide, please. She also is a woman of her generation, and as a women's history professor, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how she really fits into her generation. She's not a 20th century person, in my opinion. She's really a 19th century person. She was 28 years old in 1900. So she was really formed by the 19th century, not the 20th century. So what were the things that really are shaping her worldview? And there's two women's history ideas that are very applicable and very consistent with the way she behaves. One is something called Republican motherhood. And this goes all the way back to the time of the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, as you know, the monarchy is defeated, and the famous story when Benjamin Franklin walks out of Independence Hall and they ask him, hey, are we going to be a monarchy or are we going to be a republic? He says, a republic if you can keep it, right? So this idea of the doubt behind, can you keep a democracy intact, has always sort of been a nagging question. Well, one way that the republic was going to be held together was going to be because women were going to play an important role. They weren't going to play an important role in political leadership. They were going to play a role in the home, because how do you learn how to be a citizen? How do you know what your role is as a citizen? Your mother teaches you from when you're little. And so this idea of the importance of women teaching the principles of the republic, small r, right? The republic is important, and the country depends on it. The republic depends on women and their activities in the home. So women are the keepers of the Republican principles. And certainly Geraldine Thompson exhibits these same ideas that women understand how to keep the democracy going in the private sphere, in the home. The other idea is true womanhood. And true womanhood is the idea that while men are interested in money and business, women are interested in children and the home. And this was very much a 19th century idea. Women were moral and good and nurturing, and they knew what children needed, and they knew about cleanliness. And this idea is certainly part of Geraldine Thompson's worldview. The idea that women know this better, and they can bring this to society. They can bring these skills to society to fix society's problems. So I think that this idea that women have a very important role to play in society is something that Geraldine Thompson really understands on a very deep level. Next slide, please. So who was she? Right? So she's born in 1872, so she would have been 150 years old this year. She died in 1967, so she lived 95 years. She has a very, very long life. I told my son my book would have been done by now if she hadn't lived 95 years. Not going to be in the cards, right? But she came from a high society family. Her mother was a Livingston, and the Livingstons were founders. They signed the Declaration of Independence. They fought in the American Revolution. They were colonial governors during the colonial period. So she has this very old family. And she also comes from a family of reformers, women in her family that were very deeply involved in reform efforts. Next slide, please. She lived in Manhattan. So she was a New Yorker. She doesn't come to New Jersey until after she's married. She grew up in Manhattan during the winter, and in the summer, they would go to the family's house up in the Hudson River Valley in Statsburg, which was only a couple of miles away from FDR's home. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's home, Springmore in Hyde Park, was only a couple miles down the street. They were essentially neighbors. Her brother and FDR were very good friends. They grew up together. Next slide, please. So what shaped her? And I just want to talk about a few of her mentors, her teachers, and things that I think make her her, right? That's my overall idea today. My goal is for you to understand a little bit of what made her her and what made her found the VNA. One of the things that made her her was her grandmother. Her grandmother, who she's actually named for. She's named after her grandmother, whose name was Geraldine Livingston Hoyt. Her last name was Hoyt. But she was one of the founders of the State Charity Aid Association of New York. So the organization that Geraldine Thompson ultimately brings to Monmouth County had been founded in other states. And the New York branch, her grandmother was involved in the founding. She was also involved in the first nursing training program at Bellevue Hospital. That after the Civil War, nursing becomes professionalized, and Mrs. Hoyt and some others go to England and they talk to Florence Nightingale and they're like, all right, how do we do this nursing training? And they bring it back to Bellevue and they begin a nursing training program. She also was involved with doing reports. Her grandmother would go to Blackwell's Island, which was where the institutions in New York City were, and she would do reports on what the conditions were like, how people were suffering, how they were being treated. And she would bring that home and then go to Albany with it and say, look at how bad things are at Blackwell's Island. You guys have to do something. So she grew up with that influence, her grandmother's influence. So I just want to read you one thing about her grandmother that I found in a memorial booklet. So there's very little. When you do women's history, you're dealing with scraps and fragments, right? There's hardly anything left about any of these women. And so her grandmother, when she died, had a memorial service, and the memorial service booklet was published in a small number, for the family. And so in the memorial booklet, they describe her. So this is how she was described. This is how Geraldine Thompson's grandmother was described in the memorial booklet. Few people know anything about the family from which Mrs. Hoyt came, have failed to notice how capacity for administration seems to run in it. It is certain that the trait was very noticeable, and in none of them more than in Mrs. Hoyt, whose practical sense and shrewdness were constantly displayed in the works of charity to which she devoted herself. Kind and forgiving as she was, she made herself everywhere felt. After her death, someone at Bellevue Hospital asked, what special ward had she been interested in? The answer given illustrated the effect of her influence. It was neither one ward nor another. The whole hospital was Mrs. Hoyt's. So the idea that she obviously very influenced by her grandmother. She's exactly the same way. Great administration, cares about everybody. So Geraldine Thompson's grandmother is an enormous influence. Next slide, please. Education is really important as well. Now, Mrs. Thompson did not go to school. In the 1880s, when she was school aged, she was tutored at home, as was common with the very wealthy families. Like Eleanor Roosevelt was tutored at home as well. But when she turned 15, her family went to France. And while she was in France, she spent 2 years at a French convent school called the Sacred Heart, the Sacré-Cœur. And at the Sacred Heart School, they followed a specific mission. And the mission of the Sacred Heart School was developed by a French nun, Madeleine Sophie Barat. And Barat believed that the way to change society, the way to make social change, was to educate women, which was not a very popular idea, to educate women. But Barat believed very much that in order to repair society, you had to have what she called valiant women, women who were cultured, women who were moral, virtuous, and helpful to others. Well, I think that Geraldine Thompson certainly got this message because she really lives it in the 2 years that she went to school in France. Next slide, please. The next thing that I think really shapes her, in addition to her grandmother, in addition to her education, was her sisters. Her sisters, two older sisters, Ruth Morgan and Margaret Norrie, were absolutely probably the most central people to her. And they were both very important reformers in New York, very well-known women. They founded a club for women named the Colony Club, but they were both very heavily involved in their own interests and organizations. Ruth Morgan was the vice president of the League of Women Voters and worked with Carrie Chapman Catt for suffrage. And then for peace, she was in France during World War I, and she worked for peace after that. And Margaret Norrie, who was a progressive reformer fighting for labor, fighting for the better conditions for the workers. So three of them all have that same drive, but for different purposes, for different organizations. Next slide, please. Margaret Norrie died at a very young age in 1927, and it was devastating for Geraldine Thompson. It really changes her whole life. And she essentially dedicates her career to her sister's memory. And I found this in Margaret Norrie's memorial, another memorial booklet here, but in Margaret Norrie's memorial, it mentions that what her skill was, right? So in Margaret Norrie's memorial, it says, Margaret Norrie took the unpopular side, facing the scorn and sneers of friends, but facing also the facts, realizing the extent of the opposition. She was of the kind to make any renunciation for herself at any price if it meant to benefit the common weal. To be unpopular because of her championing unpopular causes, that meant nothing to her. Next slide, please. And what I found really interesting about that was that I remembered I had read a quote from Geraldine Thompson from the 1960s, where she was asked what was the secret to her longevity. And in the answer in 1965, so this is over 40 years later, she says, keep working for at least one cause, preferably an unpopular one. So she literally constantly coming back to the idea that you have to fight for the people who don't have anybody else to fight for. Next slide, please. The thing that really changes the trajectory of her biography is tuberculosis. I don't know exactly when. She only talked about her own tuberculosis in one interview that I can find. But as a young woman, so I'm thinking somewhere in the late 1880s, she contracted tuberculosis, and it had an enormous impact on her life. She does recover, but it completely changes everything, and I think is a major inspiration for her to start the VNA as well. Could you change the slide? Next slide, please. The tuberculosis was the biggest killer of the 19th century. It's probably, in the history of humanity, the biggest killer over the history of humanity as well. And there was no cure for it. Tuberculosis, there was no medication, no treatment. And the only thing that people were advised to do was to take a sanitary regimen, complete rest, for months or years. Good nutrition, cold or hot, dry air. So the whole section, I have a very big section in my manuscript about tuberculosis, so it really plays, it's almost a character in the book as well. Next slide, please. She said that she had to travel around when she was young. She ends up in Colorado, where a lot of people went for the cure because it had elevation and dry air. And so she goes to Colorado and she spends a good deal of time there, and she does recover. Now, it only goes inactive. You know, tuberculosis sort of lays dormant in you forever, but she does live, obviously. She also meets her husband, and she met Lou Thompson because he was also a victim of tuberculosis, and so they had that in common. Next slide, please. So this was one of the things that really changes her life, is that she meets her husband in Colorado, and her husband, Louis S. Thompson, and I love this picture of them together. Only picture I have of them actually together, it's a really sweet picture, was the son of one of the directors of Standard Oil. And so Lou's father had amassed an enormous fortune working for John Rockefeller at Standard Oil, and had bought a farm here in Red Bank, right? The horse farm here in Monmouth County, New Jersey. So it's through tuberculosis that she meets Lou. She meets and marries Lou after a very short courtship. I think they only knew each other a few months, and they got married and moved to the farm. Next slide, please. And so she moves to Brookdale Farm in 1896 as a new bride, and this is her first time living in New Jersey. So this is what brings her to New Jersey, and she moves to this famous horse farm, and this becomes where she raises her family, and it also becomes the headquarters of all her work in social reform and politics. Next slide, please. And so the farm is also a character in the book because it hosts hundreds and hundreds of meetings, and she always opens her house, always opens her land, always opens her door to the community. When they needed her, she always generously gave of her space and invited the community in. Next slide, please. And so in this slide, you see her at a meeting there with some people, everybody, you know, very seriously taking notes on her directions. But this was commonplace, right? She uses her home as her headquarters to direct all her work. Next slide, please. So this was something that was really interesting that I found. I found this letter a couple of months ago, and I call it the Dearest Honey letter because it's a letter, the only letter that I have between Lou Thompson and Geraldine Thompson, and it starts off, Dearest Honey. And in Dearest Honey meant that it landed in the miscellaneous folder in the archive because nobody knew who Honey was except me, because I know Lou's handwriting. And I looked at this letter in the miscellaneous file and I said, that's Lou Thompson's handwriting. So it never says Geraldine in the letter, but I know who Honey is. The end of the letter is what intrigued me. Next slide, please. The end of the letter, and this is a really long letter, and mostly about fishing, because that's Lou, right? Lou's always fishing. And so at the end of the letter, he gets personal with her, and he says, there's nobody after you. You don't have to run around like one possessed. And this really, I found this really interesting because Mrs. Thompson did not want us to know her. We know all the things she did, right? We can make a big long list, but she never wanted us to know her. And what this told me was he's worried about her driving herself. She drove herself. Her passion, her energy, her relentlessness, right? She's the woman who stomps the mountain lion. And so he's really telling her in this letter, honey, take care of yourself. Don't run around so much, right? Rest. So it really was, to me, a real insight into her personality, which is what I'm trying to say, right? I want to know what made her her, what I want to understand her. Next slide, please. So let's get her to the VNA. Why does she form the VNA, right? She could have just sat in Red Bank and in her big house and big farm and sat there and had tea parties every day with her friends. What makes her a reformer? What makes her a philanthropist? She had women, other women in New Jersey who brought her in, who recruited her. And one of these women on the left is a woman named Emily E. Williamson. And the woman on the right is Caroline Alexander Whitpen, both completely forgotten. There's almost nothing about these women anywhere for you to find, but they are the bomb. These women are the first reformers in New Jersey history. Emily Williamson on the left, she's the one who founded the State Charity Aid Society for New Jersey. The woman on the right, Caroline Whitpen, was the daughter of John Stevens of Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken. Both incredibly active, important women. And they were devoted to child welfare, to prison reform. They were horrified at when you went into a jail, there were children there, women and men incarcerated together, mentally ill people with incarcerated people who were violent criminals. They were trying to bring attention to these abuses. So these women are really amazing. Next slide, please. And they really recruit her. And I'm still trying to find that real direct connection, but it's clear to me that these women recruit Geraldine Thompson into statewide work. One of the biggest things that women did in order to enter politics and reform was to join women's clubs. And the most popular one was the State Federation of Women's Clubs, and Geraldine Thompson was a member of the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs. And there were more members of the women's clubs than there was for the suffrage. The Carrie Chapman Catt told the people who were in the suffrage organization in New Jersey, you know, don't bother, just join the women's clubs and infiltrate the women's clubs, and then you'll get women to join suffrage, because suffrage was not that popular, but the women's clubs were. So these women in the women's clubs really combined patriotism and goodness, like I said earlier, with Republican motherhood and true womanhood. They want to protect the democracy, and they want to protect family and children. And they get involved with writing studies and reports, just like the grandmother did going to Blackwell's Island. These women are writing reports and then taking them to Trenton and shaming the legislatures. Like, can you believe what this is going on? You've got to pass new laws. And this was the way, they didn't have the vote. How were they going to make change? So they use the power of shame. And that's what Geraldine Thompson does. She would go to these Monmouth County freeholder meetings, and she would terrorize them. And there's meeting after meeting. When she would show up at these meetings and speak, I think they must have been shaking in their boots when she would show up. Next slide, please. First time she enters the record, right? So I'm in the archives looking through all these boxes of records. I want to see, where does she show up in the records? Sometime between 1809 and 1810, she begins to become active. I don't know exactly when, but I know by 1810, she is listed for the first time on the board of the State Charity Aid and Prison Reform Association. This is the statewide one. And she's 38 years old, right? So she's not doing this in her youth. She has a whole nother career after her children are raised. She doesn't start her career until she's 40 years old. And she's urged by Caroline Whitpen to do a study of Monmouth County poor laws. And this is what gets her involved. Next slide, please. So she investigates the Monmouth County poor laws, and what she essentially finds is that there's no services here. The only county institution was the jail. There was no services, there was no help for people. And next slide, please. And so ultimately, there's several stories that are told by her daughter. Her daughter, Betty, left several letters about the family history and about the history of her mother's work. And she tells several stories about Geraldine Thompson helping people who were her neighbors, people who were suffering from tuberculosis all around her in Monmouth County. And one of the most stirring stories that Betty tells is the story of one night, Geraldine Thompson was reading a bedtime story to the children upstairs in their bedroom when her father's valet came in the room to get Mrs. Thompson. And Mrs. Thompson runs out of the room, runs out the front door. So all the kids, something's going on. They run after her. And on the front porch was one of the African-American grooms, the young men who worked in the stables at the farm. And he's probably only around 10 years old. And he was hemorrhaging out his mouth, right? So when you have tuberculosis, an abscess can form in the lungs. And if that abscess impacts an artery, it causes a hemorrhage. So Mrs. Thompson knew this, right? She had had tuberculosis and had her own hemorrhages when she was suffering with it. So she starts ordering people around. She tells Lou, go get the doctor. Lou runs in, jumps in his Packard and speeds out the driveway. She tells the staff, I need ice, I need a hot water bottle, I need towel, I need blanket. They all go scurrying. She takes the boy who is hemorrhaging and she goes and sits on top of the hill behind the house. Drier air up on top of the hill. And she puts the hot water bottle on his feet. She puts the ice on his chest. She tries to staunch the bleeding that way. And she sits there and she waits. The doctor arrives and it's too late. The young man has died. And the doctor says to her, Mrs. Thompson, this boy is dead. And she said, I know. And he said, you did everything right. And so there's stories like this throughout this early period of her career that light a fire in her, that make her a relentless advocate for help. Next slide, please. We know that by June of 1912, she is ready to start Monmouth County Organization of Social Services. In March of 1912, the state had passed a law that every county had to build a tuberculosis hospital. And so she was interested in forcing the freeholders to do just that. She wanted to get the freeholders to build a hospital in the county to serve the residents because she was seeing tuberculosis everywhere, all around her, in her neighbors, on her own farm. And so in June of 1912, she went to the Monmouth County Freeholders meeting and asked for the county to pay to send a 12-year-old African-American young man from Long Branch for tuberculosis care at a sanatorium. Because Monmouth County didn't have one, she wanted them to commit to pay for his care. His family did not have enough income to pay for his care at a sanatorium. He had an advanced case of tuberculosis. He had already had an arm amputated. The tuberculosis had spread from his lungs into his bones. He was a terminal case. And his name was Arkansas Bass. In the newspapers, they referred to him as Arkansas Bass. And she said that not only was this humanitarian to give this young man proper care, but if you leave him in his home, it's going to spread tuberculosis to the other members of his family. And at that time, his mother and his twin brother and sister were still in the home. And this article in the paper says that she does convince them that a week later, Arkansas Bass was sent to the Trenton Sanatorium, quote, through the efforts of Mrs. Thompson. Next slide, please. So I know this is going to be hard to read, but I just, do you have the census one up? Was that the last one? Could you go back a slide, please? So, all right. So this is like watching that show, Finding Your Roots. Okay, so forgive me for putting the census document up there, but I just want to show you something. I found Arkansas bass, all right? I was really desperate to find out what happened to him, right? What happened to Arkansas bass? I found him in the 1915 census. So the federal census is every 10 years and the state census is on the fives. So 1910, he's in Long Branch with his mother and his twin brother and sister and a baby who died of tuberculosis, by the way. 1915, he's still alive. He lived 3 more years at least. We see him here listed on the census in Hamilton Township. And I was like, oh, he lived a couple more years. Now, he's not in the 1920 census. So we know somewhere between 1915 and 1920. But she does give him the care he needs. And in the 1920 census, his mother and his brother Oscar and his sister Ella are also still alive. She saves them, right? So sometimes you have to really kind of think even further out. Not only does she save Arkansas bass, but she also saved them. Next slide, please. A couple of weeks later, she holds the first meeting of the Monmouth County State Charity Aid and Prison Reform Association at Brookdale Farm. As I said, it's her headquarters. She always invites everyone. She invited anybody who wanted to come to her farm. She said, if you come by train, I'll send a car for you to pick you up. Right, so she really is trying to encourage people to engage. And I have this picture of her on the porch because I kind of think of her like standing there thinking, is anybody going to come? I put out the invitation. Is anybody going to show up? And the newspaper reported that 150 people came. Now remember, not a lot of people lived in Monmouth County in 1912. So 150 people came from all over the county. And they elected her president of the new association, and she remained the president for 40 years. She was the president until 1952 when she retired, and she never missed a meeting in 40 years. She also gave $1,000. 1912, $1,000 was an enormous amount of money. So she also she also is generous. She gives the money to get started, which was about 1/3 of their budget. They had like a $3,000 budget. She gives $1,000 of it. So that good Standard Oil money went for a good purpose. Next slide, please. And so here's the MCOS logo. So I think that we all agree, I think Dr. Landers kind of referred to this before, that the branding was not great back in the day, right? Not great branding. But I love the MCOS logo here. It's all intertwined. The M and the O and the S's are all like interlinked like a chain. And so it really kind of is trying to talk about that idea of the interconnectedness of the different efforts. Also, Mrs. Thompson's other daughter, Puss, wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940 where she invited Mrs. Roosevelt to an event for MCOS, and she called MCOS my ma's favorite child. She was a piece of work, Puss. So she's making a joke, right? My ma's favorite child is MCOS. None of us, but MCOS. Next slide. So next is the organizational chart, and I just think this is so interesting. So remember, no services are provided by the county. MCOS is going to provide everything. Parole, child welfare, assistance to the elderly, and they are the only ones who are really deputized to do not only to do the investigations that are needed and also to provide the services. She builds a public-private partnership, which is still relevant for your organization, that she believes that you have to have buy-in from the community, you have to fundraise from the community, but you also need the support of the county leaders. You need a budget. You need to have some money given to you by the county as well. Next slide, please. It's immediately a success. State Charity Aid Society and after that, MCOS are immediately recognized on the state and the national level and are praised immediately in the papers. That it is really interesting how quickly it's recognized. Next slide, please. And they are recognized in the 1913 State Charity Aid and Prison Reform Association annual report. And this is from the state level now. I found this in the state archives, that their annual report said it was that the Monmouth County branch was the newest branch, and that it was the most active branch and the most well-financed branch. And it had already accomplished some very interesting things and is developing a most wholesome public sentiment throughout the county, which means much for its future. So yay us, right? It's going great. Next one, please. Next slide. But there was a big fight ahead. Still no tuberculosis hospital has been built. The county freeholders did not want to pay for it, and they kept putting obstacles in Mrs. Thompson's way. They told her, we don't know that there's really support for it. So she goes out and she gets a petition going. And she gets thousands and thousands of signatures on petitions saying that we need a hospital and we support the building of a tuberculosis hospital. And so on this slide, there's this article that says, she walks into the freeholders meeting. Again, I'm telling you, she walked in there and terrorized these people. And she lays great bundles of paper on the table. She brings all these petitions in with 12,000 signatures, which represented half the voters in Monmouth County in 1916. Next slide. But it's still not approved. So 1912, she's saying, you've got to do this. 1916, she's still saying, you got to do this. Here's petitions. 1918, they're still refusing to build this tuberculosis hospital. And during the war, they were saying, well, the war is going on. We don't have the money. We can't build this hospital. And I love this one because there's the article says, oppose building the hospital, right? And in the article is a little sentence in here because she goes to this meeting and I believe she's a little hot. All right, so it says, Mrs. Thompson came to the meeting well fortified to combat the inexpediency idea that was known to exist in the minds of the freeholders. She, quote, went over the top at the outset with an offensive that threatened to engulf the members of the board. So I think she, tears a strip off of them, I guess, is the way it goes. Ultimately, I think she lost her temper, right? After 6 years of begging. Next slide, please. But she never gave up. And in 1921, the hospital does open. And so what's the message, right? I told you she inspires us, right? When there's something you really believe in and your community really needs it, never give up. Keep fighting. Stomp that mountain lion. Next slide, please. She taught us nothing is futile. Even if a project gets results once out of every 10 times, that is something to be thankful for. At least that much has been accomplished. So she is driven and she never gives up, never gives up. Next slide, please. And this is something that Dr. Landers mentioned also. The organization has always been flexible to the needs of the community, has always been nimble. In 1930s, there was a cruise ship that went on fire off the coast of the Jersey Shore, and 125 people died in the Morro Castle disaster in 1934. 22 nurses from the VNA were first responders. Always responding to the needs of the community. Next slide, please. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, during the 1940s, World War II, housing was tight. She opened up her barns and housing she got furniture and she had apartments all over her land. But throughout the 30s and the 40s, all the way up until today, Mrs. Thompson used the VNA as an organization that was flexible to suit whatever the community needed at that moment. Next slide, please. Eleanor Roosevelt was a close friend of hers, and there's a picture of them sitting in Mrs. Thompson's living room, meeting with a group there, and was a great ally. Now, Mrs. Thompson was a staunch Republican, and Mrs. Roosevelt, of course, a Democrat, but that did not matter to Mrs. Thompson. You have to work together. You have to work with people. Another great inspiring lesson of Mrs. Thompson. Next slide. Mrs. Roosevelt wrote about the VNA in her column. And so she wrote in her daily column, which she wrote in 1946, My Day, she wrote, quote, "There is one county in New Jersey." It's very hard for me not to do an Eleanor Roosevelt voice when I read Eleanor Roosevelt. "There is one county in New Jersey, Monmouth, which I think does an exceptionally good job through its social services. And this is largely due to an outstanding citizen. Mrs. Lewis Thompson has had a hand in all the welfare organizations of the state, but as she lives in Monmouth County, that county's organization for social services reflects her interest and personality. She cares about people, and this interest at home has taken her to her state capital and to Washington, D.C. Mrs. Thompson, of course, could not do her work alone, and she has a splendid cooperation. But she gives inspiration and energy and courage, such as few citizens give to their welfare work of their communities. Now the Monmouth County Organization for Social Services is raising a fund for the erection of the Geraldine Thompson building. This will be their headquarters, and its very name will inspire those who work in it to better citizenship, right? Goodness and patriotism, morality and democracy. They are always paired together. Next slide. Mrs. Thompson's favorite prayer was this: Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Thank you.